In this podcast, Ben Shapiro discusses Joe Biden's State of the Union address and critiques various aspects of it. He starts by highlighting the divisive nature of the address and how it missed the mark in terms of appealing to independent voters. Shapiro criticizes Biden's approach, describing it as polarizing and nasty, which may not resonate well with the average American voter. Shapiro paints a grim picture of American politics, comparing it to a circus filled with clowns. He discusses the lack of professionalism and competence among politicians, both on the left and the right. He points out the absurdity of the behavior exhibited by some members of Congress during the State of the Union address, highlighting the performative nature of their actions. Shapiro analyzes Biden's speech, pointing out its flaws and inconsistencies. He criticizes Biden for focusing heavily on issues like the war in Ukraine, while neglecting pressing domestic concerns like the border crisis and inflation. He also takes issue with Biden's comparison of the current state of the country to World War II and the Civil War, arguing that such comparisons are exaggerated and misleading. Shapiro dissects Biden's rhetoric, particularly his attempts to label his opponents as enemies of democracy. He criticizes Biden for drawing parallels between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the events of January 6th, calling it a manipulative tactic to demonize his political adversaries. He argues that Biden's framing of the situation is misleading and lacks nuance. Shapiro acknowledges that the actions of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were fueled by false claims made by Donald Trump about the election being stolen. However, he emphasizes that the event did not signal a collapse of democracy in the United States. He criticizes Biden for using the narrative that democracy was in imminent danger to rally support for his re-election. Shapiro contrasts Biden's approach to previous presidents, specifically highlighting his criticism of Donald Trump. He points out the irony of Biden invoking Ronald Reagan while lambasting Trump, suggesting that Biden's rhetoric is hypocritical and politically motivated. He questions Biden's sincerity in upholding democratic values, given his selective focus on certain issues. Shapiro discusses Biden's use of rhetoric and how it shapes public perception. He critiques Biden's strategy of painting himself as a defender of democracy while casting his opponents as threats to the nation. Shapiro argues that Biden's divisive language and fear-mongering tactics are counterproductive and undermine the potential for bipartisan cooperation. The discussion then shifts to the topic of abortion, with Shapiro pointing out the significant shift in the Democratic Party's stance on the issue over the years. He criticizes Biden for presenting abortion as a fundamental freedom and attacking the Supreme Court during his address. Shapiro highlights the inconsistencies in Biden's statements regarding democracy and freedom, pointing out the contradictions in his arguments. Shapiro also addresses Biden's comments on taxation and billionaires, calling out the president for spreading misinformation. He refutes the claim that billionaires do not pay their fair share of taxes, citing his own experience of paying millions in taxes each year. He criticizes Biden's proposal for a minimum tax on billionaires, explaining that it would not address the root causes of inflation and economic issues. Shapiro discusses Biden's proposal to lower prescription drug costs by flying individuals to other countries to purchase medication at a lower price. He criticizes Biden for not addressing the root cause of high drug prices, which involves other countries negotiating lower prices with drug companies. He argues that the U.S. government should intervene to ensure fair pricing for American consumers. Shapiro highlights Biden's handling of immigration and border security, particularly his response to a member of Congress raising concerns about illegal immigrant crime. He criticizes Biden for downplaying the issue and attacking former President Trump instead of addressing the concerns raised. Shapiro points out Biden's mispronunciation of a victim's name and his failure to acknowledge the impact of illegal immigrant crime. Shapiro criticizes Biden's focus on climate change and transgender rights in his address, arguing that his proposals lack feasibility and practicality. He dismisses Biden's plan to cut carbon emissions by 2030 as unrealistic and points out the lack of widespread book bans in the country despite Biden's mention of the issue. Shapiro also takes issue with Biden's stance on crime reduction, questioning his claim that crime is decreasing under his administration. Shapiro strongly criticizes Biden's handling of the conflict in the Middle East, particularly his moral relativism and lack of support for Israel. He condemns Biden's perceived equivalence between Israel, a democratic state, and Hamas, a terrorist organization. He argues that Biden's focus should be on pressuring Hamas to surrender rather than on criticizing Israel's actions in response to the conflict. Shapiro deems Biden's proposal to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean for humanitarian aid to Gaza as a misguided and dangerous idea. He questions the practicality of the plan, highlighting the risks of American involvement in a region controlled by Hamas. He criticizes Biden for prioritizing aid to Gaza over addressing the root cause of the conflict, which he believes lies in Hamas's refusal to surrender. Shapiro expresses his frustration over the arrest of a Gold Star father who confronted Biden during the State of the Union address. He criticizes the media's favorable portrayal of Biden's performance and contrasts it with the treatment of the Gold Star father. Shapiro argues that the media's bias in favor of Biden overlooks the concerns of Americans affected by his policies.